Should I remove this? Should I unmute?
Ready to start? A very good morning to the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you can hear me clearly. My name is Simpiwe Ngangweni. I'm the CEO of the National Agricultural Marketing Council in South Africa. We are an advisory entity to the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development in South Africa on all issues relating to agricultural marketing policy in the country. Of course, we all know that before you market any product, that product must meet specifications that are required by the market. And this talks to the way that you produce, the way that you basically take care of the product until it reaches the market. The kind of work that we do basically relates to advising the minister on policy making in the sector, but specifically relating to agricultural markets. In terms of the policy space that we play on, we also get requested on many occasions by the minister to assist in coordinating policy making in the country, various policies. And recently, we have been privileged to coordinate what we call the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. This is a plan that basically government, private sector, and all players have agreed that this is the plan that will take the country forward in terms of making sure that the sector grows in an inclusive manner. And one of the questions we've had to answer is whether this plan is climate sensitive or climate change sensitive. And I can testify that there has been quite an intensive effort during the process of negotiating this policy with the stakeholders to make sure that it is indeed climate change sensitive. And this is, of course, the topic of discussion for this dialogue. Now, this session that we're going into now is themed agriculture and water challenges in sub-Saharan African rural communities. And we're going to start off with a keynote address that will set the scene for the rest of the proceedings for this session. The keynote address will be done online by Dr. Mengestab Haile. He's the Regional Director for Southern Africa for the World Food Programme. But before we get into the session, as I said, the keynote presentation will be followed by some guest presentations. The presenters are here ready for the presentations. This is basically a continuation of the setting of the scene from the morning. The session will unpack challenges in the sector, and specifically water challenges. It will also identify gaps that are there based on the experiences of the presenters. It will highlight experiences, initiatives, and opportunities for making sure that these challenges are resolved. So I'm going to come back and introduce the speakers, but let me start with the main speaker, or the keynote speaker, Dr. Mengestab Haile. As I said, he's the Regional Director for Southern Africa for the World Food Programme. Because of time, I'm not going to go through his entire CV. He has occupied diverse professional posts, ranging from university lecturer in Ethiopia, a research scientist in the UK. He also has served as a government civil servant in Ethiopia, and the list is quite long. He has a PhD in meteorology from the University of Reading in the UK, and has published several papers. Let me just check if Dr. Haile is ready. Over to you, Dr. Haile. Let's give him
Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me? Let me confirm that I can be heard first.
Yes.
Well, good morning to you all, and thank you for inviting me to this very important event to participate on climate smart agriculture policy dialogue. Now, I think the setup indicates the main thematic areas: technology, food systems, social inclusion, capacity building, partnership. And these are also Hello. So I was just hearing some backward north. Please confirm if you can hear me clearly so that I can continue.
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me, yeah?
Yes, sir, we can hear you correctly. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, so what I'm going to do is, as I have been regional director of the World Food Programme in the region, and before that I was country director of the World Food Programme in Egypt for many years. So what I'm going to highlight, this distinguished team of experts, scientists, and decision makers, is to share with you my experience, or my observation in the region. Now, everyone says Africa should be the breadbasket of the continent and the world. We talk about we have water, we have land, we have people. These are things that you hear all the time. And yet, Africa remains the most insecure continent. And why is that so? Now, over the last 2 years, I have been going around countries to understand what are the challenges, talking to governments, talking to partners, to understand what is the underlying cause of food insecurity. And what come with this is actually the food security security of our region or the continent is highly vulnerable. And the reason is, except very few countries, most of our food system is highly dependent on smallholder farms, agriculture, and mostly women. And the minister was saying there were very few women in the communication there. Well, actually, most of agriculture in the continent is done by women. So she's absolutely right. There should have been more women represented as well. So if you have raised agriculture, smallholder farmers, this with the population increase, with the climate change, with issues in Ukraine, with COVID, it is the food system is highly vulnerable. Even if there was no climate change, even if there was no conflict somewhere else, even if there was no COVID, mind you, could be still insecure in the country. The imports are increasing, the demand is increasing, population is increasing, urbanization is increasing, and then production system that we have is not going to solve that. Hence, every government that I have spoken to, agriculture must be transformed to somewhere. That is point number one. Number two, wherever you go in Africa, youth unemployment is massive. Every government is concerned about youth unemployment. And the speaker earlier mentioned about women and youth unemployment. Because if you are talking about food security, then you want people to earn or produce. Either they buy it or they produce it. If you are unemployed, then you cannot buy, you cannot have access to that food. Third element is that our young people, these young people that are unemployed, are not interested to work in agriculture. Agriculture the way it is. It is not conducive, it is not attractive to you. These are real challenges that we have in the continent. You have on one hand production that is not supporting the continent, on the other hand, the young people who are not interested in agriculture. So we must make agriculture attractive to young people. Now, how can we make that? We make that, we bring in digitalization, we bring in technology, we bring in energy. Now, I will just highlight one point. Most of you have traveled around the continent. When you go to a rural area, what are the challenges that you find in those rural areas? Clearly, you find no electricity. Clearly, you find no water. If you don't have water and if you don't have energy in a given area, your potential for transformation, for development is very limited. Hence, I call on the researchers, I call on the dialogue. How do we ensure that rural areas have what is needed for the transformation that we all seek? Because if we don't have electricity in the rural areas, then you cannot talk about agricultural processing, you cannot talk about value addition. And also when we talk about agriculture, small agriculture as it stands, you are expecting women and young people to hold the horse and dig the land. That is not going to transform. So we need to find ways of mechanizing, small mechanization to transform agriculture. I have just recently traveled to South Korea, where I saw smallholder farmers. In fact, they are small farms, but highly mechanized with small machinery that can be used by women. So it's a combination of mechanization, the combination of transformation of agriculture into a way that attracts young people is what is needed. Now, when we do all this, then we will be sure that we can adapt to climate change. My issue here is, even if there was no climate change, even if there was no other issues, our food systems, our production systems are not going to be sustainable. Therefore, I hope in the dialogue, how do we transform agriculture in the continent? And agriculture in a sustainable way, because if you travel around Southern African region, you have deforestation going on. You have livestock, wildlife being destroyed. And you cannot blame those people. But the charcoal that is being made, the deforestation that is happening, is going to contribute to climate change. And in fact, if you look at our region, the Congo Basin is probably one of the largest carbon sinks in the world. And yet, there are people there whose food security is challenged. How do we make this work? We can make this work if we transform agriculture and make it sustainable but productive. And that is what I would call. And from the WFP's point of view, we are very happy to partner with everyone. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haile. I think he highlighted quite some very key issues that we all face.
Hello, I'd like to finish here, to stop here in case.
All right, so I think, I'm not sure if we can hear each other. Can you hear us, Dr. Haile? Okay, all right. So just to conclude, I think, as I was saying, Dr. Haile mentioned quite a few key issues that I think the panel will also reflect further on. The general question of transforming rural areas in the continent, given the challenges of infrastructure as well as natural resource degradation in certain cases, but also the disinterest of youth in the sector. So what does the future hold given those challenges? Let me introduce the next speaker now, coming to the speakers that are here with us. Professor Jamie Pittock from the Australian National University. He's a professor at the Fenner School of Environment and Society. He's a director of international programs and also UNESCO chair in water economics and transboundary water governance. His current work includes developing research programs that link Australia and Southern African expertise to improve management of river basins, green water and agriculture. He's going to be sharing the presentation with Professor Henning Bjørnland, but I think we're going to be hearing mostly from Professor Pittock, and Professor Bjørnland will participate in the rest of the discussion further. I forgot to say that each presenter will have 10 minutes. So I think there's a timekeeper at the back there. So when you have 8 minutes into your time, when you are 8 minutes into your time, you'll be shown that card there, and the next card, when you are done or when you have to wrap up, you'll be shown that card. So just keep watch at the back there due to the time constraints we have. Now let's welcome Professor Pittock to the podium to address us.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure to join you in this important dialogue. I'd like to say that this presentation is not only on behalf of myself and Professor Bjørnland, but also the many other partners we've worked with over the past decade in southern and eastern Africa. Next slide, please. So our keynote speaker outlined the urgent need for greater food security in this continent. And certainly in terms of irrigated agriculture, there is both a dire need to improve the productivity of agriculture and also considerable failure to date to achieve the sort of levels of production that are promised. So irrigated agriculture obviously can overcome some of the limitations of a variable climate by providing water when crops are needed. But in Africa to date, despite hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure, many irrigation schemes produce crop yields little better than dryland agriculture. And something like a third of the command area of the irrigation infrastructure is not farmed. And so it's for those reasons that the Australian government has supported us over the past 10 years or so to try and explore ways of transforming irrigation in southern Africa. The Australian interest in collaborating with our African partners is fairly obvious. We both have fairly dry continents with enormous challenges in having sustainable agriculture in such variable climates. And because we share such difficult latitudes, there is so much that we can learn and share from each other about more sustainable agriculture. So we have been working together since 2013 in two phases. Our current phase has been engaging 42 different irrigation schemes in Tanzania, Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and working with our partners, FANRAPAN, to draw out the lessons and communicate them to policy managers. And in particular, we've enjoyed the support of ACR in funding this work. Next slide, please. So our approach to this question of agriculture and water has been one of recognising that agriculture is a complex system, and simplistic solutions such as simply rebuilding infrastructure or supplying some magic gadget aren't going to result in sustainable water use, land use and agricultural production. And for those reasons, our interventions have tried to twin both simple technological work with farmers together with some social processes to intervene in two ways simultaneously that are self-reinforcing. And importantly, to put that knowledge, experience and power in the hands of the farmers themselves rather than relying on government agencies to deliver solutions. One of the interventions has been the use of the simple-to-use soil moisture and fertility monitoring tools developed by Dr. Richard Sturzaker, who's here with the VIA project. You can see these tools at the VIA stand up in the dining room. And so these tools enable farmers to install sensors to tell whether or not the moisture in their field below the soil surface is about right for growing crops or too wet or too dry. When we first intervened with many of these schemes, basically farmers were drowning their crops. In some of the driest parts of Africa, they were drowning their crops and washing the nutrients away, and you would be astonished to learn that that doesn't produce great yields. With these simple-to-use tools, the farmers could tell when to stop watering, and that set loose a whole cascade of benefits, which I'll outline shortly. Next slide, please. That cascade of benefits resulted in greater yields of crops, but of course having more produce doesn't necessarily help you if you only flood the market and lower crop prices. And so it was really important to work with communities to develop a vision for where they wanted their community to be. We applied this method, horrible jargon, agricultural innovation platforms, simply inviting the farmers to come together and to imagine where they wanted their community to be. That's pictured here by their drawing, their map on the right. And then to compare that to where they are now, the picture here on the left, and work out what it would take to get from where they are now to where they want to be, to draw a line through those things that require some national capital to change a law or do something that they can't directly influence, and focus on those things that they can actually do themselves. And often those boiled down to questions like, how do we get better, cheaper inputs? Can we work together collectively to buy fertiliser and seeds together and lower the price? Now, once farmers had stopped fighting over water availability, because the tools meant that the farmers at the head end of canals could use water more efficiently, then there was the opportunity to collaborate. And similarly in terms of market linkages. Next slide, please. And so this resulted in a whole lot of positive feedback loops that resulted in farmer-centred learning, increased profitability, and more sustainable irrigation systems. Next slide, please. So just a taste of some of the results of this 10 years of work with the irrigation communities. Firstly, the number of farmers in the 3 countries who changed their farming practices as a result of these interventions was over 70%, which is a pretty substantial shift in practice. Next slide, please. And that meant that the frequency in which farmers were irrigating their fields, the interval of days between watering events increased greatly. And so in many situations, farmers were applying water only half as often and yet getting better yields. Next slide, please. And what you can see here is the combination of the farmers watering when their crops actually needed it and the innovation platforms enabling the communities to do things like buy cheaper fertilisers and apply them at rates that the soil testing said they actually needed, meant that yields of crops like maize, shown here, increased dramatically. Next slide, please. And consequently, there have been dramatic improvements in water productivity. And I think this is really significant in a continent like Africa, which has so many places that are dry, where water is so scarce, including indeed in South Africa where we are now. This kind of increase in water productivity, decoupling the volume of food produced from the water applied, is crucial for what we will need this century to feed a global population of 10 billion people. Next slide, please. And I think what's important in terms of the food security situation is that we've seen the communities that we and our partners have worked with dramatic improvements. And so these are some examples. I hope I'm not stealing the thunder of our Zimbabwean colleagues here. But you can see that before the interventions, around 78% of the farmers felt that they were in a food insecure population. That dropped to around 10% before COVID, yet only rose to around 30% despite all of the impacts of COVID on things like input supplies and access to resources. Next slide, please. So I hope this has given you a little taster of some of the key findings from this research. Others among our African colleagues will be presenting different aspects throughout the next 3 days in a little more detail. So please see them for more detail than I can cover in my now expired time. And if the last slide there's further information here if you would like to, next slide, further information if you would like to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pittock. I think very insightful and fascinating experience that you've shared with us in terms of putting the right tools at the hand of the farmer to be able to make better decisions in terms of water use and irrigation. And I think you've also shared the positive results that we've started to see in countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, in the form of water productivity, the yields, as well as ultimately food security. So thank you so much for that. Let me introduce the next speaker now, Dr. Matilda Azong Cho from Future Africa at the University of Pretoria, our host. Dr. Matilda is a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Agriculture, Earth and Environmental Sciences. She has a multidisciplinary research background which cuts across gender, application of GIS, and remote sensing in natural resource management and vulnerability and adaptation to environmental changes. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the rest of the CV, but let's welcome Dr. Matilda to the stage.
Thank you for the great introduction. And I also want to thank Panapan for giving me this opportunity to present some of my work. Good day, distinguished delegates. We heard from the keynote address that some of the critical issues is the issue of unemployment of youth and the lack of adequate attention to women. So I'm coming from that angle to give a reflection of some of my work that I've done on gender and climate change vulnerability and adaptation, which focus on smallholders. Next slide, please. Why is it important for us to focus on water and agriculture? Water is a very important resource for social and economic development. Water is required for agriculture across the agricultural value chain. Agriculture is one of the greatest sectors with very high demands for water. It utilizes about 82% of water in Sub-Saharan Africa. Due to increase in population, there has been a high demand for water, and coupled with the fact that the resource is under stress from climate change as well, there is a growing increase in a huge population of people who are experiencing water stress across the globe. Statistics shows that there are about 3.6 billion people who experience water stress for at least a month. And if nothing is done, by 2050, that statistic will go up to about 50 billion, which is something of great concern. Looking at water stress is not just a physical issue, it's also a social issue. It's caused by climate change and as well as socioeconomic and political factors. Hence, it is a social concern. Socio-economic and political determinants have played a very great role, especially in terms of the lack of adequate policy, management, decisions, and maintenance of infrastructure have contributed greatly in causing water insecurity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And above that all, climate change has also been of great concern with regards to the stress that this sector is experiencing. And this region of Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced about 74% of disasters which are related to water. That includes flooding, droughts, and storms. So if nothing is done, then the vision of achieving adequate water and also ending hunger by 2030, which is a Sustainable Development Goal 2 and 6, will be very difficult to accomplish if we do nothing about the current state of events. Next slide, please. So, when we talk about smallholders farmers, these are not just a homogeneous group of people. They are different in terms of gender and other social inequalities, like you have age, income, educational background, and that's any ethnicity as well, and that also contributes in creating the differential impacts that the smallholders farmers experience. So we've heard from previous speakers that women play a great role in the agricultural sector in most of our rural communities in Sub-Saharan Africa. However, the challenges that they experience are both general challenges which are experienced by both female and male farmers, as well as some gender-related challenges that women face on account of their gender. So the general challenges that they experience, the first is basically depend on the fact that the farmers depend on rain-fed agriculture, and given the variability in rainfall as a result of climate change, this is becoming a great challenge for farmers. Secondly, they operate in small scale and mostly individually. As such, their resources are so limited for them to invest in inputs as well as in irrigation systems in order to improve on their farm requirements. Then poverty is also an additional factor that hinders their investment. Low literacy level was also found from my research as one of the limiting factors. Then coming to the gender-related issues, it's the number one, we know how important land is for agriculture. So my research finding identify unsecured land tenure system. Most of our African countries do not allocate land to women, especially through the inheritance cultural practices, which favors men against women. So without the means for women to acquire land, which they own, and they are able to take major decisions in terms of investment, both short and long term, it becomes very, very difficult. One of the findings that I had during this research was that women are a bit hesitant to invest in input because they don't know when they will lose that land since they do not have ownership of the land. So that is a huge barrier in this part of the world. Then access to education was also found as a very limiting factor, which we will see as we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So here you find the implications of the issues that I raised in the former slides on agricultural water use. Due to a poverty situation, farmers are unable to invest on irrigation systems and also on the inputs to improve on their agriculture. Then, as I mentioned, the cultural bias against women in terms of unsecured land tenure system, it contributes to the lack of the will to invest on the land which the farmer can lose at any time since they do not own it. And then low literacy rate was found as a limiting factor for farmers to diversify their livelihood options. So with the huge impact on climate change on agriculture, one of the measures by which farmers adapt or communities adapt is by diversifying their livelihood sources. So with limited education and limited means of income, they find it very challenging to do so. Then, from the policy dimension, the lack of gender mainstreaming was found as a very huge concern because all the policy documents that I examined, nothing was mentioned about gender. And aside that, even though there was that policy document, which was like an agricultural adaptation plan, the implementation on the ground was also found as a gap. There are those beautiful measures outlined, very effective measures on the paper, but when it comes to implementation on the ground, through my fieldwork, it was found lacking. Let's go to the next slide. So from my findings, I came up with these recommendations that even though women are faced with those challenges, women are agents of change. They are not helpless victims. So they are trying to group themselves into associations to be able to pull their resources together to overcome those gender barriers. So we can leverage on this sort of association network and policy can promote cooperative for farmers, which will enable co-learning and will also enable easy interventions and facilitate the marketing of their produce. Then policy should also focus on increasing finances for the investment on irrigation systems for farmers and also on inputs. Then lastly, but not the least, climate change adaptation policy should ensure that gender is properly integrated. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, to address the water agricultural crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa, we need to change the current mode of practicing agriculture. We need to increase farm investments and ensure that gender is mainstream. So I end up with these quotes from Elizabeth Wotuti that let us apply our hearts in our discussion to think about the voiceless people who are under the threat of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Matilda. I think this is your... Thank you very much for highlighting the important issue of gender mainstreaming. I think the message is very loud and clear. No policy should forget the issue of gender, and I think the message was made very, very well there. The next speaker is Ms. Mary Jane Gabriel. She's the Director for Water Use and Irrigation Development at the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development in South Africa. I think she was briefed about the time constraints, so she didn't give us the CV. Let me call Ms. Gabriel to the stage to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. All protocols observed, and I'd like to welcome you all to South Africa. It's nice to see a lot of friendly faces. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, and then the next slide. Okay, we are about 122,000 hectares in terms of the size of our country, and about 15% of that land is under irrigation. Under that 1.5% of that land, we produce about an estimated 30% of the total crops under irrigation. 1.6 million hectares is under irrigation, as previously mentioned, of which about 50,000 hectares is under smallholder farmers. Irrigation in South Africa is power intensive and very water intensive. Actually, as Minister mentioned, we utilized 60% of the total surface water in the country. Next slide, please. So the national imperatives that we currently have indicates that the national growth path wants to target an additional 300,000 households in agriculture smallholder schemes. The National Development Plan intends to increase irrigated areas by 500,000 hectares. We thought 500,000 hectares is not achievable, but the research that was funded by our department, that was done by IMI, by the International Water Management Institute, indicates that during certain seasons, there's about 70,000 hectares in Limpopo only that is utilized for irrigation that is not on the record books of the department. And because it is seasonal, it is not under our records because they just grow, the smallholder farmers grow their crops, cabbages, lettuce, carrots, and then it's done for the next year. So it isn't under anybody's record. However, we have seen this through satellite imagery that has been undertaken. The National Water Resource Strategy indicates that there is only 50,000 hectares for expansion of irrigation in South Africa. The Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program and the Ilimalizima program of the department is what is utilized to implement irrigation projects. So these projects include revitalization, expansion of irrigated areas, as well as the water use and management of water on farm. And then we have the agriculture and the agro-processing master plan, which was mentioned by Dr. Simpiwe. And that also indicates certain initiatives that the government is going to undertake in terms of irrigation development. Next slide, please. So we've also developed the irrigation strategy in 2015, where we intend to increase the contribution of irrigated agriculture to the GDP, poverty alleviation, employment creation, and skills development. We hope to increase equity of access to water by previously disadvantaged communities, or let's call it what it is, black farmers. We hope to contribute to food security and improve social economic conditions at household and community level. We hope to improve planning and investment coordination. We hope to increase investment in skills and training of farmers, extension workers, and irrigation specialists. We hope to increase investment in relevant research and to increase irrigation water use efficiency. Next slide, please. So in terms of increasing equity of access, because we are not the authority that allocates water to our farmers, what we built is strong institutions so that we are able to access water for our farmers. This includes the coordination committees of agriculture, the various committees with water and sanitation. My minister has mentioned that we keep on asking for water and they keep on telling us that we already have the biggest allocation of water. But as I mentioned to you, our farmers continue to use the water, albeit only on seasonal level. So we still maintain that they are now having equity of access to water. Then we provide funds for the water use license applications, as well as the implementation of irrigation projects through our CASP, as well as the Ili Malitima programs in our country. Next slide, please. Improving planning and investment coordination. As previously mentioned, we have built strong collaboration institutions with various national, provincial, local authorities, as well as the farming associations and traditional authorities. As Mr. Diacha has mentioned, he wants to hear solutions, and this is part of the solutions that we have provided in terms of the government initiatives we've undertaken. We collaborate with the Department of Water and Sanitation as the authority on water in the country. We have formulated the water use and irrigation group where we plan for the next financial year and future financial year on any irrigation projects undertaken in our provinces. And obviously we have the CASP committees which fund these irrigation projects. Next slide, please. So in terms of our contribution to food security and household and community level, certain of our areas still suffer from drought, and we use rainwater and grey water harvesting techniques as part of our initiatives for the climate smart agriculture. We do it in collaboration with the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment, as well as GIZ and other institutions. And basically, as you can see, our farmers have taken initiatives where this rainwater harvesting and this tower gardens are producing food not only for the household, but also for the community. In the Eastern Cape, we believe that certain neighbors that cannot afford food is just donated food by these initiatives that the department has undertaken. Next slide, please. So in terms of increasing investment in relevant research, skills and training of our farmers, etc., we provide financial support for research relevant to the irrigation sector through our various research institutions, the Agriculture Research Council, the Water Research Commission, the universities, etc. We provide financial support to roll out training on new technologies which we have developed, including the decision support system. And in South Africa, as you well know, we also use a lot of satellite imagery to determine the areas which are irrigated and how they will be affected with climate or weather changes on a local level. We invest in training of irrigation specialists, farmers and extension officers. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the increase of irrigation water use efficiency, we undertake several revitalization initiatives where the government provides for funding, where we are changing to more efficient technologies. Our minister mentioned moving from sprinkler to more efficient technologies, but it's actually moving from flood irrigation to drip and micro irrigation. In terms of expansion of irrigated areas, we are also undertaking to implement water efficient technologies in those areas. And then we're piloting the use of wetting front detectors. The chameleons in your presentation, yours and Dr. Lazaro's, actually was done in collaboration in Silverton, not 5 kilometers away, of which we are in the compound. So chameleons is, we can also say is proudly South African.